Thank you. Let's all welcome Christy.
Thank you, David. So I'd like to especially thank David, Anissa, and James for the warm pre-welcome they gave me in coming here. I'm so excited to be with you. I'm ridiculously excited that it snowed, and and I was threatening to go make snow angels, but I haven't done that yet, so maybe later. We might need a little bit more. It felt a little like there wasn't enough to guarantee success in snow angel making. As David mentioned, I'm Christy Spackman. I don't know how to describe myself as a scholar. I'm a transdisciplinary scholar. I would call my disciplinary home primarily science and technology studies, which itself maybe is a discipline, but maybe not, depending on who you're talking to. But I'm trained in molecular biology, food chemistry, the culinary arts, and then capped it all off with food studies. So I am a bit of a hot mess with regards to disciplines, but I bring it all together through thinking about smell and taste and how those things function with relationship to our bodies, and also how we can look at specifically the molecules involved in smelling and tasting and think of them as forms of data that can either be divorced from bodies or brought together with bodies. And most of my research has been looking up till now at water as this carrier of smell and taste, or this thing that most accurately we tend to ignore as not having smells or tastes, and the work that's gone into erasing taste from water and how that then has essentially divorced us from thinking about our environment and about the infrastructures that are shaping that environment and what interventions we could be making in helping preserve that environment. So let's say 3 years from now, I look forward to sharing my book, Making Nothing, with you. But in the meantime, that's where I am. And in addition to the one appointment David mentioned, I'm also split between a School of Arts, Media, and Engineering, which is just still blowing my mind. I don't know what they were thinking, but I'm like, okay, we'll run with it. You want to let me play with stuff? We'll play. So it's been 5 days since the 2020 Consumer Electronics Show. And I don't know how many of you were following it. You may have heard some stuff about, things that will bring you toilet paper if you run out of toilet paper, or magic diapers that somehow alert you when the diaper needs changing. But in addition to that, there were a few different offerings of electronic noses. So these are bits of technology that are offering to essentially do the work that your noses might do when they're working at their best, at a way that's even better than what you can do. And I'm really intrigued by these things. This is the sensor that could catch the smell of burning bread in your oven and turn it off for you. Woohoo! I mean, wouldn't that be great? As a child who's burned my mother's bread, yes, it would. But at the same time, these sensors are kind of telling us a story about what odors are and how they function in the world. They're suggesting that there are these things that are out there just waiting for surveillance in a way that our bodies can't actually do that. And this is, I just want to acknowledge that some of the stuff I say today is going to be a well-duh moment, so this next one is. But they're well-duh moments that come together in a much larger story for why we should actually pay attention to things like smell and taste, because it's pretty easy to ignore them. Those are just, things we deal with for pleasure. Those are things that we don't necessarily need to really pay attention to. And in the case of this instrument, it depends on data, right? It depends on multiple forms of data. There's all of this information that's been pumped into it, but that data itself came from another series of bodies. And what we're going to think about today in the next 40 or so minutes as I'm talking with you and then as you talk with me is how that information came into being. And we really want to question how those instruments get their data. What are those historical processes, of course, that have shaped this thing that brings us to the moment when that instrument can be there? And so we're going to be thinking about olfactory data, taste data, the ways in which things that seem so simple, like the Pepsi challenge, which if you have never seen these ads, you should go look them up, they're great, are tied up in much larger sorts of questions about who belongs and how they belong, and what molecules should or should not even be present and circulating in the world. So when I talk about olfactory data, I'm thinking in a very specific way, and I want to acknowledge that this comes from my molecular biology training. I think of data, olfactory data, as molecules. But I also think of olfactory data as these things that are called odorants or tastants. Those are the molecules. And then when they interact with the body, they go from being an odorant to an odor, a tastant to a taste. And so they're data that require both attending to these molecules as they circulate, but also the instruments that detect them, sensing bodies or instruments. And so let's hop back to 1964. By the way, this image every time just catches me. So this is published in Life magazine, and it's just before a report on student protests at Berkeley, with the clash between police and students that are. It's the summer of '64. So just heading towards all the wonderful, crazy stuff. Not summer of '64, December of '64. So this woman here is in a 6-foot long glass tube. I can't find it. Nobody claims to know where it is anymore, but it was there one time. It's about 18 inches in diameter, the reports say. We question that. And this is an experiment that's seeking to identify whether you could actually figure out a human's olfactory fingerprint. So what the scientists did was they just took her, she went inside, they ran air over her for 45 minutes, and then captured all of the stuff at the other side, concentrated it, and analyzed it using some recently developed instruments. And their thought was, hey, we think that we can understand not just how olfaction works, but how olfaction is tied to people. So just briefly, who are these scientists? The lead scientist, Andrew Dravnieks, was born in St. Petersburg in 1912. He did his training at the University of Latvia, was there for both Soviet occupation and then German occupation, and after World War II left, came to the United States to do his doctoral work at the Illinois Institute of Technology, and then he spent the rest of his career there at their outreaching research arm, the Illinois Institute of Technology Research Institute. And most of his work was focused on odor, specifically pollutants. And what I'm talking to you today about is primarily an analysis of the work he's done. A specific set of papers is what I'm going to draw from, but I want to acknowledge that even though if you were to go look for him, you're not going to find in Google's citation metrics these huge numbers of citations. However, if you go look at the way people think about and research odor, what you are going to find is that the methodologies that go into the data that made its way into his papers today are the foundations of how scientists working on smell and taste understand and think about the world. So even though this case of sticking a woman in a bottle is really extreme, the techniques that are developed for it are really important for what goes on later. So to peer inside olfaction, to think about olfaction as data, we also need to think about bodies. And thinking about something like smell and taste means we think about a very specific aspect of the body. And since I do smell and taste, we're going to think about this olfactory organism that's linked in with the alimentary canal. That means we're going in through the mouth and the nose, and we're going all the way down and out, not just through the guts and our anus, but we're also going to think about all the other places that olfactory things come out of, like our glands, our sweat, just all the bits of the body. So it's going to be fun, a little gross, a little wonderful. And in this process, we can think about the ways in which these carnal things, these desires and passions that are all associated with smell, also then go back into those potential surveillance practices. So one of the key characteristics of odors is that they're volatile. They're readily vaporizable at a relatively low temperature. And you guys have played around with temperature and pressure and smell at times, inadvertently. Heat something up, easier to smell. Cool it down, harder to smell. Great way to solve the problems of bad tasting water in Arizona in the summer. Ice. So grateful for it. So this volatility is what makes it possible for our bodies to actually sense the data available from odorants that are out there. So briefly stepping back even a little bit more in history and thinking about what odors are and what they do, it's helpful to think about the fact that there are different olfactory eras. That there were times when the smells that you and I would think of as being totally disgusting were just not even relevant to people because they didn't pay attention to them. And historian Alain Corbin suggests that people actually in France went from being unaware of odors, so there's this I guess we could call it a great awakening of awareness of odors, and you get the rise of the perfume industry and shifts in hygiene, et cetera, as people try and control their bodies. And it becomes this thing that distinguishes, do you smell like you belong or not? So, we could invite you to do something a little awkward. Sniff each other. Or sniff yourself. And there's this question, like, do you smell as if you belong here or not? And how do you even know that? So we have this thing nobody's actually doing. Sniff yourself. James, thank you for actually doing the arm lift. We'll get to armpits in a little bit. But these are like our social margins of do we belong or not. And we know this, our bodies have, are any of you runners? So few of us. You go out and you run for 5 miles, it's okay. You run 26.2 and you're just disgusting. You're unacceptable for larger society until you change that. So, and thinking about the ways in which not just smells separate out who belongs and doesn't belong also invites us to thinking about the ways in which people just separate smells out in general. So the late 19th century and most of the 20th century are just filled with all of these instruments of trying to figure out how we can actually separate out and identify odors and figure out what they're doing. And I've got one of the first olfactometers here. This was developed in the late 1800s by a Dutch scientist, and then next to it is what would be considered still kind of the current way of understanding and thinking about what molecules actually cause smell. So this is the gas chromatograph over here on your right side. How many of you have done chromatography in chemistry classes, like in high school? Will you explain to us what it is?
It's been a while.
Go for it.
I don't.
It's really been a while. So you might remember you would take like a drop of something and then stick and put it on a piece of paper and then stick that paper in a solution, and that drop of something would separate out into the multiple somethings as the solution traveled up the paper. And the idea of chromatography is you can take complex mixtures of things and separate them out into the individual components. So pretending we were all in a bottle, we would be the complex mixture, and then that door would be the thing that separates us out as we exit out. We all become the separate molecules. And so chromatography, which is developed in 1952, opens up this whole new universe for people who are interested in volatiles, specifically gas chromatography, because you could take something that normally wasn't in a solution, is instead floating around in the air, and separate that thing out. So, kind of cool. And when that happened, you get about a decade of what I like to call the proliferation of peaks. Our scientists were like, cool, we can analyze everything. There are 10 years of just papers with these peaks, and then suddenly people are going, hey, what is, I don't remember, this looks like it's probably, oh yeah, chocolate. So different aromas of chocolate. Okay, cool, peaks. If you were looking at that, which of those molecules, so each peak identifies a molecule more or less, which of those molecules would you think matter to the aroma of chocolate? Let's take Trinidad. A? Why A? Dangerous. Cool.
Probably means it's the relevance here.
So this is awesome, because that's what people were thinking. And then at one point, they decided, we don't actually understand which of these molecules matters to sensation. So you get this cool moment where researchers at Colgate-Palmolive decide instead to stick a perfumer in what they called the bird cage. And rather than having an instrumental detector at the end of the chromatograph, you had a human there sniffing. And they're the first ones who actually codify this, although people had perhaps been doing it anyway. And as they're doing this process, they start to realize that, oh wait, the molecules that matter are often not those great big huge things, or the little bumps at the very bottom that we didn't know we needed to pay attention to. And so you get this interesting new hybrid of human and machine working together to figure out which of those molecules out there are actually data that matter. So in the process, these instruments materialize the idea that a molecule could have a specific sensation associated with it. That you could look at something like that molecule up in the upper left-hand corner and say, that is lemon. Or the one below it, that is musk. And so you get this new sort of relationship that starts to emerge This is a relationship that for sensory scientists who are really interested in, making money out of our desires, became very interested in. Which molecules elicit pleasure and which molecules inspire disgust. Because we've got this idea that there's this emotional interaction between us and the things we eat. And if you can understand that emotional interaction, you can capitalize on it. And then you can go on ahead and lead that to consumer dollars. And you can see here from this image from the 1966 Food Technology cover, that's the journal for the Institute of Food Technologists, which is the trade journal for all people who make your industrial food. Up in the upper right-hand corner, you've got the readout from the Gas Chromatograph, which is going right down to the shopper looking at something, and this idea that they've understood her well enough that they can activate her brain. And so there's this loop going back and forth between the molecules that are eliciting some sort of reaction, and then the research, and then money. So, hello, big food. And what's really fun about this is you get this moment of, maybe this isn't fun, but part of this process was going out into the surrounding environments and recruiting people to help you understand what mattered. So, and many times that meant middle-class America's taste, and middle-class America was what was going, or were the people who were going into the various locations and being tested. Their tastes and desires were the things that then became codified and understood and then show up once again in our foods, and you get this sort of feedback loop of creating the profile of what it is to appropriately eat in the United States, or what would be considered normal food. And some of this should look fairly familiar just from walking down a grocery store aisle sometime in the recent days. Probably depends what sort of grocery store you shop at. I am in Seattle. Any questions? Cool. Okay, so let's move on with this idea of volatility. So we had the idea that it was a molecule that was readily vaporizable. Middle English also suggests that volatility is related to the sense of a creature that flies. It's difficult to capture or hold permanently. Now, you and I know this from walking around. Odors don't necessarily emanate from a single location, nor are they particularly consistent in their concentration, and they don't actually like to stay in a single place. So how do you capture the odor of a body? And that's how we get that 6-foot-long Pyrex tube. The scientists ran 3,000 liters of air over her body for those 45 minutes. They collected it, they concentrated it, they analyzed it, and they were curious. Was her odor signature unique enough that they could distinguish her from other people? Could they tell stories from her odor about where she'd been, what she'd eaten, who she'd touched? So here's one of their conclusions. They're like, yeah, actually, we can. This isn't necessarily her. The series, actually, they don't tell you who it is, but it's a woman and a man that we're seeing. And you end up with this moment where the, excuse me, where they start saying, hey, yeah, we are able to determine what the odors are. We can see what a male odor looks like. We can distinguish that from a female odor. They then go on and do work, not just distinguishing between male and female, but also between what we could call the unmarked American body. They don't tell you who the people are that they test, but they do tell you who they tested against, which were Indian immigrant students at the Illinois Institute of Technology. And they said, yeah, you can see a difference. They essentially are naturalizing these olfactory markers into this thing that we don't need to question. It's just a quality of who you are, that somehow my whiteness would distinguish me from my friend Scott's not whiteness, and that would just show up right here for anyone to see. Kind of scary. One of the things he reported to the Chicago Tribune in an interview is that they think that each person may emit 100 or more separate odors, and that all of them contained would identify that person anywhere. Yeah, okay.
Can you just talk a little bit more about what happens between all of this air rushing over somebody and that beautiful little chart you just showed?
Sure. I can do my best. They don't give you tons, like going back and looking at the papers, they don't necessarily, there's some definite elision of information that goes on. But essentially going back to the gas chromatograph, so all that air rushes over the body, they capture it, they condense it down, and then that is what goes onto the gas chromatograph.
Okay.
It's measured over, comes out. We can only assume, this is where the problem is, they don't tell us if these are detected by someone sniffing or if these are just the different peaks on the gas chromatograph. Based on the other stuff in the larger context, I believe this comes from someone sitting there sniffing, and we'll get to a later point where you'll see why I think that. But that's essentially the process that's going on. Any other questions? Thanks for asking that. It's a great question. So we get this computational crunching. Essentially, I just want to capture, here's the armpit thing, capture the idea that we're very distinctly linking odors with bodies and reactions to bodies. And this was from the Washington Post a while ago, where they're saying that deodorant might actually make you smell worse. So all the more or antiperspirant, all the more reasons to, I don't know, just enjoy our body's odors. But this moment where he's computationally, we could say in a way, crunching this instrumentally generated data that's so critical to sorting out the differences between some individual's olfactory signature and someone else's, is essentially, I think, recreating these social processes that are linking, that have existed for generations, of linking ethnicity and race to sensory data, where you're saying we can just tell who you are by how you belong using these very, maybe not distinct markers, but these markers that have been culturally ingrained via something like the fact that, oh, this is how Middle America eats. You are part of this group because that's how you like to eat, or not. And we get this mechanistic reading where odors are allowed to essentially become fetishized as molecules, these things we can measure using the chromatograph, these things that really do represent what's going on. And this logic about race, identity, and biology is most apparent in his work on defense contracts. So this is a picture of on the left, the General Electric people sniffer. So he didn't work on that. And then on the right, a bomb detector that he has, that's Dravniak's on the right, that he had helped develop. So he had a contract from the Department of Defense to work on something similar to the people sniffer during the Vietnam War era, where the idea was, okay, he's now proved that he's proved that you can distinguish different bodies. Could we go into Vietnam with this sort of olfactory detection thing and identify enemy soldiers without ever seeing them, just based on smell? And you can already imagine all of the problems associated, like how do you know if this person is or is not friendly just based on smell? There's all of this. Yeah, so much fun to critique, so much to worry about at the same time. So we're essentially seeing the instrument becoming this way of allowing outsides and insides to collapse together into something that can just be measured, something that no longer carries with it all of the social implications. So it might have been due to the limitations of that whole body thing, it was too big, or due to a lack of funding. Again, he was with a research institute whose job was to go out and collect money from outside contracts to do their research, but he ends up in the 1970s refocusing the gaze of himself and his research team away from the whole body and instead onto the porosity of the single opening, the female vagina. And so with funding from the Norwich Pharmaceutical Company and a team of physicians at the Chicago Medical School, they start looking at and trying to characterize the odor profile of what they're essentially calling the disordered vagina. So they're like, okay, ladies, why do you stink? And rather than putting the woman in the tube, this time they put the tube in the woman. So we have a picture here of the vaginal insert that was put in. Initially, this must have been so uncomfortable. They would stick the insert in and then run the air right into your vagina and out again. So that not very great picture on the right. You can kind of see there's a woman on the left side of a wall and the tubes are running into her and out again over onto the other side of that wall, where they were once again being collected, condensed down, and then separated out again on the gas chromatograph. And they later moved to just doing this insert that would be put in, and then you'd pull the insert out and collect it.
Who are the research subjects? Are these, again, students?
So in this case, or at least in these papers, they are women recruited from the local area. So he's working on the south side of Chicago in the 1970s. Does anyone know when the race riots were in Chicago?
60.
So by that point you would think you'd have a fairly African American population, but he's only reporting in one test like 7 white women, 2 African American women, so, and then 1 other, I think, Latino woman. So his sample subjects are not necessarily representative of where they are, and the women are being paid for their participation. I cannot tell. He has a research assistant who's a female, and I can't tell if that's the woman in the tube or not. Like, I've never been able to find a picture of her, and I don't think she participated in these as a research subject. I think she just participated in these probably as the assistant who was helping the women to make them feel more comfortable. But she's passed away, I can't, or if she isn't passed away, I can't find her. I did manage to find Dravniak's grandson. He apparently lives in Mesa. So, small world. Any other questions about the women? We'll get a little bit more about them. I'm very intrigued by the fact that it was Teflon coated, just given the way that Teflon itself is imbricated in all of these other mini fascinating stories. It's got this amazing ability to minimize friction during transformations in some material state. So you could think of it as the frying pan. So, fresh Teflon frying pan, amazing for making that perfect egg. It's also really great for sending NASA spaceships up into space. And it's also really great if you don't want to introduce additional secretions potentially into the vagina, with this assumption, of course, that there are no sorts of material exchanges actually happening with the Teflon. Another story, another question about different forms of data, but I think it's interesting to just call attention to. So the authors note in their paper that vaginal odors can come from a variety of substances. Some of those are of biological origin, so you've maybe got microbes in there, leftover semen, just normal mucus, etc. Some of those are things that are coming from medicinal products like douches, and then also they may be influenced by whatever you've eaten. So again, that idea that this nose and mouth that may elicit desire then are going to perfume your body in various different ways. So you get this general link between what you like, what you desire, what you eat, what you ingest, and your overall, or at least their medical gaze of conceptualizing how they imagine health. So we get this different form of olfactory fingerprint, rather than of the whole body, of a specific space within the body. And I see in this something really interesting for thinking about this larger question of how olfactory data goes out and circulates. So we finally have made it to our third definition of volatility. And this is a volatility that tends to erupt in violence or is easily aroused. So when you're measuring smells and you're trying to transform subjective information into a number that can circulate, one of the best ways to do this might be through what we call the hedonic scale. Have any of you ever used or come across these? I see yeses. What situations?
Medical? Like, how much does it hurt?
Okay. I've always found that really difficult, the 1 to 10 scale of how much does it hurt?
Yeah.
I don't know. I hope it's not a 10. Anyone else? Where else have you come across it?
Airport bathrooms.
SeaTac, yeah. And the 3. Anywhere else? So this is one of the first sorts of, or this is a really common scale. It's a Likert scale. It's a measure, like, come on, you've all seen this on your student evaluations, right? But this helps translate questions of liking into other sorts of more ostensibly objective measurements. And this is how early experiments that wanted to evaluate the quality of vaginal odors worked. So the researchers, and you're going to like this, Sarah, they identified they defined quality as referring to the type of odor irrespective of its aesthetic characteristics. So they're actually saying we're not using a hedonic scale. We're just going through and identifying the type of odor. And at the same time, okay, I got this backwards. So they're identifying the odor. They're giving it a name, irrespective of its aesthetic characteristics. But then they're also decided to adopt a hedonic scale. And they did that partly because of, and this is their own words, quote, partly because of its erotic appeal, and partly because of the intensity of its broad dynamic range. And that's where the quote stops. So the 1970 tests don't actually specify which of the male authors smelled the odors coming off of the GC column, but by 1973 they do report that they used, quote, a single observer, a skilled chemist. So thinking of this, I like to think about this as essentially tying us back into larger questions of connoisseurship, even though they definitely did not situate themselves within the realm of connoisseur, because we have this question of what is expertise around measuring odor. Is the expertise just embodied in a single body, as it would be with a connoisseur? How many of you are wine drinkers? Really? Only 3 of you? A few more. How many of you would actually call yourself connoisseurs of wine? No one? Maybe? Go for it. Sarah, why?
Well, I make wine.
Okay. We all know who to invite to our next party. Okay, so you make wine.
We read the Butler paper
Mm-hmm.
with the little research group, and I think some of the instrumentation, conversations that the study has about the training of taste
Mm-hmm.
made me think of the wine industry, because there's a whole lexicon that people have when they talk about off flavors and distaste, and it's a sort of trained judgment.
So one of the tricks with connoisseurship, however, is it resides in the single body. And if you're trying to make an argument about yourself within a larger realm of or scientific world, or more likely, if you're a large industry, you actually would like your expertise to not rest in a single body, because those single bodies can go somewhere else, or they can die, or they can get sick. This is the problem actually with perfumers. They're way too specialized. We need to be able to distribute that information out. And so a lot of what happened over the 20th century with sensory science was this desire to distribute out expertise, to find ways that you could not only have connoisseurship, but instead multiple people who had this ability to taste together to develop shared language, which also shows up in the wine industry. And if you're ever bored, it's kind of a fun party trick to do. Sit down with 5 different balsamic vinegars and taste them and come up with shared language for them. And at your next party, bring all of the descriptors. Maybe not balsamic. Cheese is a little more fun. But so by measuring this, by drawing on that hedonic scale, and by suggesting that a single skilled chemist paired with a measuring instrument could be objective, the researchers are situating themselves both as connoisseurs in a way, single bodies with unique knowledge, and as experts. And they're experts equipped with all of the authority that instrument then had given them through that measurement. And so let's look at the results of the typical odogram. And so just briefly back, this is from one of the tests where they were sticking the Teflon insert in the woman's vagina to measure odors. They, of course, because they were being funded by a pharmaceutical company, were looking at odors before and after treatment. And so what do you notice here? Typical odogram before treatment. How would you describe this? Based on large numbers and descriptors. How do women smell?
Not good.
Not good.
Yeah. I mean, we've at least got floral in there.
A couple pleasant.
A couple pleasants. But overall, it don't smell so good, according to this very objective measurement of a typical odogram. So this comes from a 24-year-old woman. She used the pill for contraception. She'd agreed to not have sex for X number of days, and to not, I think it was a week beforehand, to not shower or bathe for 72 hours beforehand. So she's walking in, and to not douche beforehand also. So she's walking in a more natural state, if you will, as opposed to the perhaps more curated state that bodies might be in if you're in the habit of bathing every single day.
What do you make of the hedonic reading that's coded as XX and XXX? What is that about?
So if I remember correctly, neutral equals neither pleasant nor unpleasant, X, double X equal don't smell good at all, and P equals pleasant. This is an intensity thing. So what do I think of it? I have very strong opinions about it. But what are you thinking in asking that?
What it suggests, like, porn, right? I mean, that's how porn.
I had not thought of that. That's brilliant.
Well, I mean, it's like high hedonic and very unpleasant.
Uh-huh.
I don't know.
Yeah, that's great. I'm going to have to go back and rethink this.
So just to clarify, these are distinct molecules that have been separated out for odor, and each one of them is rated.
That's what this is doing. So we see not just distinct odors, but a lot of odors. And I'm going to skip ahead really quickly to show you the contrast after medication, even though we'll hit this later in the talk. So this is post-medication. And I want to call your attention to that specifically because of this idea of like just you can almost imagine them talking about being overwhelmed, like, oh no, this is too much, we need to rein this excess in, something's just not right here. And essentially from them we get this idea that without intervention, women are just going to stink, and they're going to stink in ways that drive away rather than attract erotic attention. And the statement from the paper obviously caught my attention. They said the character of olfactory stimuli variably influences interpersonal, sometimes erotically, intersubcultural, interethnic, and interracial relationships. The perception of vaginal odor is comparable to the social offensiveness of the odor of sweat or perspiration. Please.
So what was the thing that's being treated? The person's being treated for what?
Nothing. This is just douching, essentially.
That's the treatment. Okay.
Yeah. So we have a few different treatments. Like, essentially, can we rein in vaginal smell?
And so the results were basically that fewer odors were detected, but it didn't look like they were necessarily any more pleasant.
There are fewer unpleasant odors also. So fewer odors detected, and it comes down. But let's look here a little bit more closely at this question of how they went through. So this again is the sort of untreated body. We can see neutral, pleasant, and some more of these appear as pleasant in a way when we look at it this way than it did in the other way. Sorry. The part I'm really most interested in is the neutral, pleasant, unpleasant, your NPX categorization. But this helps us see the ways in which this linking of hedonic liking to that characterization and classification with a name, and although they don't show this later connection with the molecule, how you get this sliding scale between this thing that exists in nature and this very human aspect of saying this is valuable or this is not valuable, this is pleasant, this is not pleasant. Even though those ideas, and I see this essentially that by using the instrument, by linking molecular data pieces with names and that qualitative evaluation of goodness, you see the male gaze kind of slyly, and here I'm drawing on the visual studies, media studies aspect of the male gaze, just slyly extending into that olfactory register. And it's hiding how those patterns of pleasant and unpleasant are really rooted in these men's cultural expectations. So why do we care? Because, again, this is something that's almost not at all cited. It's information, by the time they're doing this research on douching, it's starting to fall out of practice, at least amongst white women, but we'll get back to that. We care in part because these processes that he's developing here are the processes that then come to shape his later publication or his work on the Atlas of Odor Character Profiles for the ASTM group. And this is still one of the most widely used compilations out there of how you link together or how you give name to what an odor is. So if you're an odor scientist, this is the sort of thing that you're drawing on. This is these practices of making, understanding, naming, and characterizing odor data are all related to these other practices of racially distinguishing, gendering odor in ways, and then categorizing bodies as being in need of treatment or untreatment. By using that gas chromatograph and its separating powers, we see the skill of the chemist transformed into measurements of liking and not liking, and then transformed into a form of objectivity, something that's just hiding away that role that their personal preferences were playing. And I'm just so intrigued by the glass tubes. This is one of the tubes that's used for actually concentrating down that excess amount of odorant into a smaller amount. You could trap those volatile molecules in place until they could be analyzed later. And doing this, it solidifies an understanding, again, of smells as molecular. They're imagining these odors as both perceptibly, so things you can smell, and imperceptibly, things you can't smell, shaping our behavior. They point in one of their papers to the biological role of odors in attracting or repelling sexual partners. They very specifically are like, these odors are not all that different from the pheromones we're seeing in primates, et cetera, et cetera. You get this idea that they need to be controlled because they are shaping attraction, that there's this question of how the volatility of the molecules that circulates around. And you know this from being on the we'll say the bus here. Subway's a little less present. But the way in which a person can be absent, but you can nonetheless end up smelling a trace of them. You don't have a choice in whether you do or do not inhale that thing. That unlike tasting, where it's this very active form of like opening your mouth and putting it in, smelling, you're just so vulnerable. You have no way of escaping because you can't even necessarily see these bits of data before they end up in you. So once you smell it, like you've already ingested it. There's no going back. It's in your body. And so this glass tube's not only offering justification for erasing the causes of those smells, and in this case, often microbes, it's also marking what's dangerous and how we can remove it. And this comes back to this question of the treatment, like the idea that those smells in the woman's body are so dangerous, so they need to be treated, with an approach that specifically looked at reducing the microbial presence in the vagina. Ordering vaginal microbes meant ordering the vagina, and in the process meant potentially preventing infidelity. So not only are you ordering the odors, you're ordering the microbes, you're ordering the odors, you're ordering society. So, oh no, it's too late to cry out in anguish, I've lost my husband because I wasn't using Lysol in my body. So, yeah, right? So we get, we just, I love this case because it's got so many beautiful pictures to think with, and it's so frustratingly, obviously, at this point in time, something you look at and say, what were you thinking? But I also love this case because it takes us back to these other questions about what volatility is and what the moments of danger are. So thinking back again to that opening picture of the woman in the glass tube, I mentioned to you that article in Life was juxtaposed against these protests at Berkeley. And so we have a different form of volatility, the volatility of crowds and maybe of fear communicating itself to each other, perhaps through pheromones and other things. And this brings us back to this larger idea of what does it mean then to have these new electronic noses out. And people have been trying to do this for a while, so I'm still a little skeptical, but they might be getting there. There might be enough data that's been generated at this point that these technologies can actually be brought into being where you could analyze using these sensors the odors out there. You could start policing bodies. Specifically, you could be doing surveillance of, we'll just run with that, bodies in ways that, if we can characterize the entire olfactory world, that's a big if, but assuming that we could be like, okay, here's the formula for all of the known perfumes and other things. Let's break that all apart. And okay, there is your olfactory fingerprint. How do you obfuscate that? I can put on a mask to obfuscate my facial recognition stuff, but how do you deal with these much larger questions, especially when that data that comes into it itself is already carrying with it in many ways various forms of cultural baggage. So that's where I'm going to leave you today. Thank you.
These are devices that are used for people on probation?
No, this is a different one, but we can talk about those too. So yeah, that's the core of this. Thanks for this opportunity to talk to you about it. Please.
One of the things that struck me when you showed us the chart of like the descriptors was that a lot of the descriptors were of food, and so I'm wondering if there are any arguments that are being made about like the link between smells and tastes and how we differentiate between those, and specifically to this case, if you could make an argument about how consumption is often gendered, and so the way that we describe women's vaginal odors is an argument that we can make that sort of parallels that sort of dynamic as well.
Mm-hmm. I think my answer to your question is yes. These are all really important and good points, because the idea then that if what you eat perfumes your body would tie into these larger questions of how women are invited, or sometimes it's how we choose to eat. I'm not going to eat garlic because I'm going to be in intimate conversation with people, and for some reason I've decided that's a marker of bad breath, and etc. So yes, it all carries this larger thing. And part of what you're seeing there with those food names or things that you associate with food is, again, that's where we as individuals have so much of our experience with aroma is through what we ingest. And so it's either the natural things around us we smell, and these are just the words we've been able to give meaning to. Artist Cecil Tolas is attempting to create an olfactory library, and they are using all made-up words for it, which I think is really interesting work.
When you were talking about the kind of averages of the women smell of the vagina, well, actually, okay, this is kind of a two-part thing. So I'm curious if there were or parallel studies being done with the similar holds of male bodies, like if there was like a whole comparison.
You won't be surprised. The answer is no.
And then I'm curious also, like, if you had any thoughts about, so previous to that, you mentioned that there's some research funded by the Department of Defense to try to smell out some counter people during the Vietnam War, and so there it's like kind of like trying to create this system that can smell like an entire body, and then with the studies on women, it's like a very specific part of the body. So I'm kind of curious if you came across any justification of like that slight, or that kind of difference in like units of analysis.
So the justification for why they moved to the whole body, to the part of the body, in many ways seems to be related to the fact that they actually found the whole body so difficult to deal with, since bodies themselves are such different sizes. I don't believe their thing that claims it's 18 inches in diameter, because I have read an account of a man in that tube, and when you think of 1.5 foot diameter for a set of shoulders, that has me pretty squished, and I don't have a huge shoulder width. And so, but there are these larger questions of, I think they started to hit these limits, and they probably also hit fiscal limits. Again, this is a very entrepreneurial research endeavor, and so I feel like in trying to track down what they're doing, you're tracking the ways in which financing itself moves. And so as the Department of Defense financing dries up, the war ends, they turn their attention elsewhere, where, how can we take this larger question of odors as pollutants, that's their research agenda, and get funding to continue running down the road of, to me, their real agenda was, how do we characterize the smelly world? And whatever way they could do it was how they went about doing it.
Thanks for a super interesting talk. Wondering, has anyone ever tried to make smells like portable, like by digitizing, so we can send in?
Yes, there's an O-phone app I think you can actually buy, and you can get a little emitter and have it on your phone. Like you could send your friends or your enemies smells. I mean, they had that. And Crystal Lee, she's a doctoral student at MIT, has done a little bit of work on how odors themselves are being used through that app in ways like emojis are to communicate very specific sorts of sexual or non-sexual commentary on some moments that are happening.
And so you have to attach a little.
You do have to attach a little thing. The actual question of digitizing and then remanufacturing odors, as long as you have a known odor library, that itself isn't very hard. If you want to manufacture on the fly, like in a virtual reality environment, that's much more challenging and hasn't yet successfully been done because of the way in which, like, to really capture the nuance of odors, it's not just one odor. There are lots and lots and lots of smells, as you know from your own experience. Cut grass has certainly the smell of hexanol, but it probably has lots of other things, and that's going to change based on the temperature and the time of year and things like that. So if you were to walk through a virtual environment on virtually cut grass, you would want to not just have the flat, uncanny valley of smell. It's like, here I am. You would want the variation. When you're bored, the dark side of me will have something to tell you about this in probably 5 to 10 years, because we're working on a project on that at ASU. Sure. You guys can paper, rock, scissors it all, the three of you.
I have a question about sort of the controls and the limits of designing these systems for scent. So I'm curious, part of me was sort of surprised that your talk focused on like the human experience of smell when like we encounter like dogs in airports, for instance, really often. And so I'm curious if these systems, like this product especially, are like using a human framework of scent and smell and olfaction to understand these things, or are they, I mean, this fits into your argument about like, you know, are they embodying human sense, or like where is it embodied? I guess like, is there capacity for something else if they were to say like attempt to like pheromonal signals too, which I understand to be chemical as well. So I'm kind of curious, like, where's the limit there? And like in these earlier studies, is it possible that the pheromones had some other role that like was not really like looked at, or?
So I don't know the answer to your last question, but I do want to talk about this larger, that's a really fun question. So again, the logic on this depends on this idea that we can take sensation and break it back down to the molecules. And with that, then all you have to do is figure out what your application is, and that's going to shape how you're going to design the machine learning, the computational algorithms. The sensors, I think, are still also not quite where they need to be. But if you were going to turn around and sell this to a food company as a way to help something, you'd absolutely want to be drawing on data that's based in human experience. But if you're going to turn around and send it to, or sell this to your airport security crowd or some other crowd like that, your bomb sniffing crowd, you're going to use a different sort of metrics. The smell of a bomb doesn't matter. What matters is, can you detect the bomb? And that's going to have to do with a completely different series of molecular signatures. So, yeah, I think the answer is yes, they're doing all those things. They're just talking about the food aspect of it because that's the aspect it's easy for them to sell right now.
So this device is fed with a set of data?
Exactly. And that data is going, so for example, this group's partnered with International Flavors and Fragrances, so they're drawing on the sorts of data that's been accumulated over the last 100 years it's called Era, or Aromabella or something like that. It's a company out of Grenoble. Anyway, so they've got that whole data set to help them. And similarly, IBM's Watson, they're doing a partnership with McCormick and drawing on that data set, proprietary data about flavors to help do this machine learning for predictive flavor making. They're calling it computational creativity, which, in that case, that's super fun and interesting and fascinating. And then there are these much larger ethical questions of what are the other things we do with this data?
Yeah, thank you so much for the talk.
Taking over.
You perhaps,
Go for it. Go.
Your visuals are amazing, and it's, yeah, just super fun and interesting. I'm like, so of course struck by how much sort of our modern day commercial enterprise is linked back to Cold War era science projects once again. People who are obviously working on like history of computing and the internet, it's like, kind of can't say it enough. But it's interesting to see it here as well. So I'd love, so I guess I'm curious whether this sort of project on women's body odor was like directly tied, how the ties between that and the projects associated with the Vietnam War were connected, if they were at all. And then I'm also just as a kind of broad, I think many of us in here think of ourselves as drawing from lots of different fields, and I'm just curious sort of how you approach doing this kind of research, where you're like, is this all from a set of specific archives, or have you drawn this together from lots of different resources, and how you came across them?
So I'm going to start backwards because backwards answers all of your questions.
Great. Okay, perfect.
I've been really stymied by lack of archive here, actually. Most of the stuff I'm drawing on is from published scientific papers, and then the rest of it's from popular articles. So Illinois Institute of Technology Research got bought up and split into two different companies, and the company that bought the part Dravnieks works for claims they didn't keep the archival stuff. Now, you know how those claims work. It might be in a basement somewhere or a garage somewhere, or it might have been destroyed. Because this was a rabbit hole and a side trail I wandered down while trying to understand the atlas of flavor and odor that he developed. I haven't yet done, for example, a Freedom of Information Act to get information about the grant application that went in to the Department of Defense, nor do I know if I would be able to get it. It may still be classified because this is the sort of stuff they're still interested in. The glass tube, again, has disappeared. I just recently found Dravnieks' family, so I haven't yet been able to follow up with them to see whether they have information they want to share with me. And then there's also this larger question of, I mean, he's amazing, and like all people who work with historical documents, I become just enchanted with my humans, but that doesn't necessarily mean I turn around and present pictures that make their families feel really happy about who their humans are. So I don't know yet. There isn't enough information for me to make those connections.
Related question
Sure.
about methods. I'm just curious, since this work hasn't been highly cited, how did you make the connection between this work as foundational to the methods that are used even to this day? Did you follow the citation trail and those few citations then exploded into others, or are you just going based on that it's the first instance of a method like this occurring, or how are you drawing that?
I'm drawing that based on what the odor scientists themselves are telling me. So even though Google's creaky metrics don't track it, it does show up in standardized textbooks. And then if you ask any of the odor scientists, hey, have you used Andrew Dravnieks' work? They're like, oh yeah, blah, 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 blah. And so it's that, and also the fact that his work ends up, that those are the methods that play into the creation of the atlas, the ASTM atlas. Because that itself, I mean, just by being, the virtue of it being a recognized standardized body is where I feel confident being able to say that this happened, because he himself cites his own work over and over again as foundational to it. So you see this iterative trying to understand how gas chromatography works. And this group of flavor, the people working on taste and smell, it's a really small group. They're all hanging out together. The people up at the NATIC labs for the Army research who are trying to understand why armed forces don't like their rations are also hanging out with Dravnieks in the same room having conversations at the New York Academy of Sciences. So it's that sort of where people are at various times that's leading me to say that. I'm also totally open to you blowing it apart at any point. David?
So I have a question about, I think this is going back to the gas chromatography as a method. So I think everything you described is I think it's a reductionist approach
Sure.
to the smell, right? So you take them apart and smell them individually. Is there, it seems like there would have to be a countervailing tendency in smell studies that says sort of the opposite, because it seems so obvious, right? Like acrid smell followed by sweet smell might be a really quite great in perfumery or something like that, which is different from like acrid smell by itself, sweet smell by itself. So does that element exist in smell studies?
So, yes, you should all go read Nadia Berenstein's popular writing, because she has a lot of fantastic stuff about this. So at the same time that some of this stuff's coming into, you're also getting these qualitative examinations of flavor attenuation. So what happens when you put two things together? How do they act? Because, they're like, wait, two things together are not equal to this. One might boost the flavor of another one. So for example, any of you who are trying to do a low sugar January, throwing a touch of vanilla into your drinks makes your brain think that it's sweeter than it is. So that sort of thing starts getting studied. And then flavor masking. How can you use one flavor to make another flavor disappear? And here Sarah Tracy's work on monosodium glutamate would be a really useful addition.
One other. So in this talk you focused on sort of the smell and human. I'm interested in the part that you're saying humans have smells, right? And they're focused on that. Is that your framing? And or meaning like you are gonna focus on like the cases where smell in humans, or is it they themselves, the scientists, who are like there's like a subfield of like humans and smells, or do they not care or parse it some other way?
So I'm not certain I understand your question. When you say I'm focused on humans have smells, you mean the odors that we produce?
In this talk you focused on the science of humans having smells, right? But is that something you've parsed out and said that's what I'm going to do for this talk, or is it the scientists who do human smells focus exclusively on human smells, and that's a subfield?
So I got to here because Dravniak's worked on taste and odor in general, like flavor, but also air pollution and everything else. And my core interest is actually in the smelling, tasting human, and he inverted it for me. Does that get
so
where
you're saying he actually worked on lots of other things as well? Okay. So in the field of whatever this is, smell science,
sure,
they don't particularly care about the human or treat it as a distinct thing?
Well, they care about humans being able to detect molecules that cause sensation, but they're not necessarily all checking out what the odors are that our bodies are producing. Estee Lauder, on the other hand, as a company, probably is really interested in that, so they can then help us mask or attenuate our own smells or boost them in whatever ways we want to. So yeah.
Who's funding this research? Because you said it was at a research institute that was sort of going out and seeking. Is it all from the government?
So, again, doing the best I have with the not great stuff. From when he's reported it, Norwich Pharmaceutical, so they produced things that you would stick in your vagina if you were a woman, helped fund that, coupled with a medical research institution that was a bunch of gynecologists. So you had that sort of funding. In the case of much of his odor funding, though, as far as I can tell, it's government funding, that they'd specifically gone after Department of Defense funding to do that, because it was all about, I mean, the idea of an olfactory fingerprint, that idea of the fingerprint is in and of itself a surveillance technique. Can you go in and find humans or find the trace? And if you've seen The Lives of Others, there's that early scene where they like have the guy sitting on the cloth on his hands for like hours, and then the cloth later is stuck in a jar and used as a potential marker of who that human is, so you can find them later, or even going back farther to bloodhounds chasing fugitives or slaves or lost people. So yeah, we've got a nice history as humans of using odor.
I was going to do, this is like more of a food studies 101 question that came up as we were just like prepping for your visit. What is the role of subjective preference in the sort of the food studies, the sort of science that you're studying, I guess?
So for food scientists, subjective preference is something they definitely want to know and understand, because you can turn that into money. But you also want to find...
Right? I mean, this is where we got stuck.
Yeah.
It's a rough question.
I know we're a little over time. Should I say to people, like, if you need to run?
Are you able to stick around for
Sure, sure.
Do you want to stay and talk more? And
Yeah.
give everybody
Okay.
who needs to get up and go a chance to exit?
Yeah, but so exit stage left and then answer question. Thanks, James.